like YouTube, something, so that people can access it. A number of people have asked, including people who wrote in the book. So we will be recording this, and then we'll let you know. We'll be on YouTube and maybe some other kind of podcasty kind of formats. Anyway, welcome everybody. Welcome the contributors and welcome the attendees. This is our second version of, second episode, should I say, of series around the different sections on resistance and support, contact improvisation at 50. And the way we'll work this, and last week, we did one and we learned some things. So the way we're going to work this, I learned that it's an hour and a half and not an hour. And but also we're going to try to do the question and answers a little differently so that people can actually see the people who are asking the questions or engage in the conversation. I'm not sure that we'll be able to open it up to everybody, but we can, if you raise your hand, Annika can then put you in, and you can see and talk with all of us. Okay, so I'll just do a little brief introduction to the collection. And then I will do a brief introduction to the section, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to talk a little bit about their contribution. And then we'll have a more general conversation among all of us in the panelists and who are contributors, and then we'll open it up to the public. One of the things I think is fun, and it occurred to me about halfway through organizing this, is that although I, as the editor, have read everybody's essays multiple times, I realize not everybody has had the chance to read everybody's essay. So this was an opportunity for people in each section to be like, oh, I read your essay, and yeah, you're talking about this. And so there, that kind of exchange that's possible. I also realized that I, probably write better than I speak extemporaneously. So I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs of the introduction so that I can be a little bit more efficient and have fewer ums in it. Resistance and support, contact improvisation at 50 reflects on the many powerful conversations about continuity and change that came out of the critical mass celebration of the 50th anniversary of contact improvisation held at Oberlin College from July 7th to 11th, 2022. This collection of essays is not meant to be either comprehensive or exhaustive in its range of topics. It does not document the complete history of CI, nor does it chart all the different approaches to this wildly inventive dance form. It does, however, include perspectives from many people from different places, providing a wonderfully rich tapestry of voices and experiences from across the world. When I first conceived an anthology coming out of critical mass, my goal was to cultivate thoughtful discussions that took the form seriously enough to be critical of it. I wanted to introduce a new kind of writing from within the dancing, one that didn't just wax poetic about its many pleasures, but could provoke challenging discussions, ultimately inspiring more intentional dancing. Most of these writings came out of a 3-day workshop that took place immediately after CI 50. 20 of us from different generations, countries, and experiences moved together, read one another's drafts, and talked about what had just transpired during the festival. Later, we had many more conversations over Zoom, at least I did, and exchanges of drafts back and forth over the course of a year. The essays gathered here are a result of this combination of editorial resistance and support, resistance as support. The writers were all wonderfully responsive, you guys, to mine and each other's feedback, and I'm indebted to everyone for believing in the importance of creating a critical literacy around this most ineffable form of improvised dancing. I'm also grateful to some of the writers who contributed to this collection who are not able to attend this extraordinary event. Their perspectives expanded these discussions of the issues at stake in dancing contact today. I decided to title this collection Resistance and Support because those terms effectively represent the wonderful mix of pushback and sincere commitment to making this form live up to its potential for inspiring social change that was a prevailing ethos during critical mass. For me, there's another meaning to the words resistance and support. When I teach skills such as giving and receiving weight from a partner, I often say resistance is support, meaning that when I resist your weight, I am in fact supporting you. Feeling that support allows your partner to keep going, to feel safe giving more of their weight. I then make an analogy between the physical and the metaphysical by talking about how it is important to be able to feel intellectual resistance as support as well. When I push back on your ideas in a responsive and not a reactive manner, it is as a kind of support, not a negation or dismissal of them. This exchange can then move back and forth, beginning an improvisation, the trajectory of which had not been previously imagined. So these sections are productive tensions, responsive touch, which we're going to work with today, and local communities, global context. So I'll just read one paragraph of the introduction for responsive touch. This section parses the question of what it means to touch and be touched, literally as well as figuratively. The discussions that follow are expansive in nature. They describe the myriad ways that haptic perception and tactile sensation bring us into relationship with others. Their focus is on somatic states of being in contact improvisation, the implications of which are always evolving. Interestingly, several of these essays refer to Steve Paxton's use of the stand and the related concept of the small dance as a foundational practice of paying attention to the subtle shifts of one's body as we experience the pull of gravity on our structure and the flow of air on our skin. These practices are important for training our dancing bodies for the unknown, for sure, but they are also deeply relevant in our everyday encounters with the forces, cultural, political, environmental, that shape our worlds. Moving from neurobiological perspectives on listening and balance to practices of attunement with natural environment, through therapeutic touch and explorations of queer intimacy, to philosophical discussions of embodied knowing and spiritual traditions, to the impact of CI on neurodivergent sensibilities, these essays attempt to articulate the ineffable experience of moving in contact with others in the world. Little wonder, then, that the writing in this section often takes on a lyrical quality in which critical analyses are partnered with poetic evocations of dancing. To touch in a truly responsive manner, one first trains one's attention, engaging awareness of those physical exchanges of weight and energy as a form of communication that, while it is sometimes troubling, can be ultimately healing as well. Thank you. So, Leslie, do you want to, we'll just go in the order that your essays are in. So to begin.
I'm happy to start. Yeah, thanks, Anne. And thank you so much for hosting us today. And again, for this project, that's been huge and complex and so much work on your part. So thank you. So I'm Leslie. I'm a Canadian artist and osteopath. And I'm always thinking about these two aspects of myself, and how they're having a conversation, throughout the 30 years or so that I've been practicing. So my research interest is really in the interrelationships between osteopathy and creation processes. And by osteopathic philosophy, I mean interrelationships in the body, interrelationships between our bodies and the systems and the ecosystems that we're embedded in. And by creation processes, I mean, creating books, paintings, raising a child, making a meal, tending a garden. So these creation processes, and there's this constant dialogue for me going on between them. CI, contact improvisation, has been a major influence in my life. I was introduced, I think, probably 25 years ago. So it's been a training and a practice that's been parallel to my body work and osteopathic practices. And it's a continual like micro to macro dialogue. So in an osteopathic practice, I'm always working on the microscopic with the person that is very much like a contact improvisation. So there's this listening and responding that's happening on a very micro level. And then those principles can be brought and shared in the bigger movement sense that we do in contact improvisation. So for this chapter, what I really wanted to explore are experiences and concepts of listening. And I wanted to really investigate it through a foundational, or what I consider to be a foundational practice of contact improvisation, which is the small dance. And I'm sure everyone who's listening is familiar with the small dance or the stand. But in case you're not, it was practice that, I mean, it's an old practice cross-culturally. It's been practiced for centuries longer. But Steve Paxton and the earlier pioneers of contact improvisation described it as a foundational practice to train attention, reflexes, physical awareness, balance, and to witness our body's organization and relationship moment to moment in gravity. And so in that way, I think of the stand or the small dance as a listening practice. And I wanted to explore what do we mean by listening? Because we talk about it a lot. I've heard it spoken about a lot in many different contexts of improvisation and movement, but particularly in contact improvisation. So I started to look up, how we're thinking about it in current culture. And there's a lot of definitions there really talking about giving ear to a sound or an utterance. Sound received by the ear. But I wanted to highlight in this work that our ears have distinct functions, and one of the functions is to hear and take in and metabolize auditory information. But another function is the vestibular mechanism that we can call maybe the ear of the body, that it's listening to how our body is responding in real time. So I looked up also the etymology of the word listen, and halisnan is the root word, and it really simply means to pay attention. So I proposed a definition that I would actually modify now, but I proposed the definition that listening is a metaphor for receiving information into awareness, and that we're having a biological response to that information. What I would modify is that I don't think it's a metaphor. It's a way of describing a certain quality of attention, right? So I broke that definition down into 3 principles, and that was what I explored in the essay. And I won't go through them all right now, but I'll just highlight. Principle 1 was listening is actively receptive. So it's not a passive act, but it's actively choosing to turn our attention towards something and to receive information. And that attention can be bidirectional, like we can be outwardly seeking attention, or we can be receiving attention. And what I'm talking about is the receptive quality in listening attention. The second principle I looked at was attention it can act as a conduit for delivering specific types of information into our awareness. And part of the practice of the stand is decreasing the noise, like decreasing the static, so that we can actually start to discern and choose where we're directing our attention based on what we would like to understand. Talked about attention and intention and awareness. We played with those concepts. And then the final principle was that listening implies that there's a biological response to information being received. So when I'm listening, my body, my physiology is having a response to you, if I'm listening to you, or to the environment. And that's an awareness we can cultivate so that we can have more conscious exchange. In contact improvisation, there's such a risk of very confused and fraught and enmeshed relationships. It's just part part of the nature of nonverbal dialogue that we're engaging. But I think there's a way of cultivating a sense of resonance. And by that, I mean the ability to co-feel with somebody, but also to still retain a sense of your own shape and your own self. So those are some of the things I was exploring. It was really fun to explore, and it was really fun to come back now, these couple of years later, and revisit the material and see how things have changed. So,
Great, thank you.
yeah.
So that's a pretty good segue, I think, to you, Gabby.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, and hello, everyone. I'm an artist, mostly making performances, dance performances. However, I just finished a socially engaged project at Forbes Library called Anonymous Apologies. I teach dance currently at Amherst College, and I am joining you today from Earth Dance, where Brando and I are leading a workshop on contact improvisation and somatic approaches applied therapeutically. And it's based on our chapter called Therapeutic Applications of Contact Improvisation. In this chapter, we discuss the ways in which CI can be adapted to reach a wider audience who may never feel comfortable coming into a dance studio or going to a jam, but who would benefit from skilled touch. Brando is a licensed psychotherapist, and he speaks to how he uses therapeutic touch in his work with clients. And I'm focused on describing restorative contact, which is a mindful touch and movement practice that I've been developing since 2019. Restorative contact differs from contact improv in that it's oriented towards slowness and stillness, and the intent is relaxation and grounding. Early on, a participant reflected to me that it gave structure to something she'd witnessed around the edges of jams, people lounging on each other in pairs or piles. And this observation, it really clarified to me that I wanted to create a formal structure for a casual body, a body at rest. Both Brando and I do a lot of sitting back to back in our practices, either in silence or combined with sounding or speaking. The back is a more protected area with the spine. It's less confrontational. You're not face to face. And it's also a large surface area to be receiving information, receiving warmth, movement, presence from your partner. We discussed the value of mutuality and reciprocal touch, as Leslie was talking about, the idea that touching and being touched are a concurrent exchange, and that there is a fluidity between leading and following. There's value to being an over dancer and an under dancer. There's benefits to both receiving and giving. So for instance, this weekend, I had participants, one person laying on their back and another person sitting up and holding their partner's head. And I asked them to consider like if they perceive themselves in the receiving or giving role, and then to flip that and to see that perhaps it could be both, or what kind of, how can we have a sort of fluidity of perception? I'd say also that another primary tenet of restorative contact is the idea of companionship, of just being and being with someone else, another person who isn't asking anything of you. They are someone else having their own experience simultaneous to your experience, and how just that can change your experience, can anchor you to the moment without a kind of touch that is asking something or trying to tell something. So a listening touch, like Leslie, a touch that is kind of open palms, a metaphor of the open palm to receive the information, to perhaps allow it to fall into your palms. We also talk about how touch is both a vehicle for connection and differentiation. So there's co-regulation and attunement that can happen when you're in contact with another person. And then there's also the reality that through the contact, you sense yourself more. And I referenced in the essay some research by Ariane Purr, and there's actually really great study that just came out last month about the effects of touch on affect, stress, sense of connectedness, and sense of self, and experimental study on contact improvisation, comparing the benefits of improv without touch and improv with touch. And basically, improv with touch provided much more positive affect, more sense of connectedness, more sense of connection to self. Um, yeah, and I'm trying to think what else. Mostly, we're really advocating for access to touch, the use of touch, to try to let go of some of our fears around touch, to realize that when we can develop bite-sized exercises that are accessible, we can give people positive experiences to replace negative experiences of touch. I mean, someone here at the retreat, spoke to how fearful they've been of touch, and that actually now they've been able to have a positive experience. And that is just exactly what I'm looking for and exactly the type of people who I want to reach. Maybe I'll pause there.
Great, thanks. Brian, do you want to take it, introduce yourself, and then talk about your essay?
Sure. Um, Thanks for being here, everybody. My name's Brian. I live here in Oberlin, just kind of down the street and around the corner from Anne, uh, and where I dance and make performances and write and think about what that means. So in this essay for this collection, I was really asking the question, okay, so when I have these dances, they're very singular experiences. There's the particularity of my body, there's the particularity of my partner's body in that particular, very particular moment and space and time that they exist. But then after that, what happens? We have memories of that dance. Maybe there's an image of that dance. It comes a video or a photograph, or maybe it inspires an essay like the ones in this volume. And what is the relationship between that very singular event of a contact improvisation dance and the more durable and kind of formalized structures that might come after it. And I was working a little bit from a premise of an anthropologist named Tim Ingold, who has this concept of the logic of inversion, which basically he's using inversion as a kind of image of an inversion of value, where he believes that we sort of, as a culture, and I agree with him on this, have a tendency to value the things that endure. The book that you can take out of your shelf uh, and whenever you want, and the essay is always there. Exactly. Over the sort of these very singular and in the moment events that lead to them. And so kind of a little bit inspired by conversations with Anne about how we might approach this, I wanted to ask how we as contact dancers who invert ourselves all the time, but also bring ourselves back right side up and invert ourselves again, uh, might address this question. So I really worked with rolling as a sort of lens to look at the process of moving between movement and thinking or conceptualizing or remembering movement. And following Leslie, I hesitate to call that a metaphor because I really want to see it as a structure where our physical embodied rolling is inextricably connected between the rolling between the experience and the memory, the experience and the reflection. Um, so to structure that, I took a kind of unit of time within my own dancing that has these kind of neat little bookends here in Oberlin, where after the pandemic, everything was quiet, but I had first little dances started, and then we had this big build up into the CI 50 critical mass event, all kinds of dancing, so much people here, so many stimulation. And then everybody sort of started to leave, and it was summer in a college town, and had sort of one more dance that was a full calendar year uh, away from the first one. And to use very specific reflections on the my memories from dances from within that year to sort of ground a more theoretical reflection on rolling as a knowledge practice.
Cool. Carol, take it away.
Okay. My name is Carol Larson. I'm also grateful for this process. I found out so much in many ways about myself in writing this essay, as well as the branches that have come from the seed that was planted in 1972. One of the things I'd like to start with is actually a Steve Paxton quote about, in 1993, he was reflecting on the beginnings of contact improv. And he said, once things were relatively simple, I thought I knew how this then nameless work should not be described. It was to be about improvisation without any ambiguous appeals to the imagination, because I did not know precisely what the imagination was. For the same reason, I would omit mention of sexuality, psychology, spirituality. These I would leave in the hands of experts and proceed with what seemed more immediate, the senses and the physical body. And what I have found is, as I've been rereading the essays from our section, is a lot of us are pushing back at that. It's not taboo is too strong a word, but the initial non-mentioning of sexuality, psychology, or spirituality, because of course those elements come into the dance. They're in the room because we are sexual, psychological, and spiritual beings. So I think it's really interesting, 50 years on, a number of us want to explore the aspects of therapeutic values of contact, which several of the other essays in the sections and the writers aren't here right now, explore sexuality and explore neurodivergent psychological processes and how that resonates within contact improv. And the piece that I went for, as it were, was the idea of spirituality. And I chose to use a word that might even be more triggering, called the religious function of contact improv. A lot of us have a reaction to what religion is or has been. Typically, in my own life, I was raised in a fairly restrictive Protestant doctrinal religion, which I rejected. Went off far away from my origin home. And at about 1920, I encountered contact in the late 70s. And something really woke up within me in encountering that particular form. And I danced a fair amount for a decade or so, going to longer events like a cappella motion or jams. And that really informed me and informed the way I know the world, and would also create these states that were non-typical for me. But I didn't feel that it was appropriate to talk about it within contact circles, partly because of this, we're not doing spirituality. This is just a visceral event. We're looking for the nuance of sensation and not whatever else arises in in different states of perception. At the same time I was doing contact, I was also doing Aikido. So Aikido very much informed me, and Aikido had an explicit spiritual content to it. O Sensei, the originator, talked a lot about the whole cosmos being involved, that each of us had a deep spirituality that came out within Aikido. He was a martial artist that worked a lot with domination and force. And then he said, I'm not interested in that. And he really investigated the soft lines and says that you should treat your opponent, as it were, as if you were cradling a baby. So when you're met with violence, you can resolve it in a different way. And Gabby, when you talked about the giving and receiving, that was so much the dance in Aikido as well. That kind of is part of the underpinnings, that the person who attacks is giving that support, because you cannot practice without a wholehearted between partners. So Steve Paxson also worked with Aikido. The Aikido role, as Brian's mentioning, the mentions, is a foundational piece. And I think that some of the idea of what it is to give, receive, harmonize, and the whole central premise of ki, which is a non-physical event of energy or connection through the entire cosmos to each individual, might have silently entered the arena of contact improvisation, because it's part of a universal force that, can be called chi or prana. In the mid-90s, I started going to a Quaker meeting, which is practiced in silence and stillness, where you settle and you listen underneath the words for promptings of spirit. And because I had already had a practice of listening for those promptings of my partner or promptings of my body with movement, I found it very useful to also work in this other form of Quakerism, which you might think was in some sense antithetical to what a jam is, because there is no overt touching. But there are promptings to action that could be found with that. And also a sense of presence. A number of the essays mentioned this presence that we live in. And when you have that presence that we in contact world create with a sort of as a haptic way of a touch inspired presence, it allows the ego to soften and to make a deeper connection with all beings, with things as it is, things as they are, and be really present within that context. And then the third area that I looked at was Zen practice, which again, I think that there's a popular idea of what Zen meditation, Zen practice is, which is different from when you enter it. It's a very visceral body practice. Sitting, for hours is like the stand, but even smaller. It's you're sitting on your sits bones. You're feeling the body and what arises. There is this constant shifting. And then walking meditation. So you'll sit for, say, a half an hour, and then typically do walking meditation for 10 minutes. And it's a breath per half step. So it's the stand with the extra imbalance of actually taking steps that you're embodying the body from. And from those practices, again, a similar sort of insight happens. And I'm just going to, I think I'll end with one of the quotes of the founder of Zen Buddhism in Japan, His name is Dogen Zenji. This is written in the 12th century. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad beings. And when I hear that sense of what it is to be actualized by myriad beings, because of my particular history, a jam is what comes up. I am actualized by the myriad beings in the room. And it's a way of studying the way we are all interconnected, which I think is one of the great insights of religious practice.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. Super, super interesting. I think maybe I'd like to start off asking you to reflect a little bit, and then you can ask each other questions too. But one of the things about all your essays that strikes me is that there's this interesting relationship between attention and awareness, that they're not the same, but they have flow back and forth. And I'm wondering if the practices of attention develop certain kinds of awareness and how that might differ in each of your kind of focuses. And anybody can take that. You don't have to go in order, or you can also ask your own questions. But it did strike me that so much of the responsive touch section has to do with attention and awareness and threading kind of awareness through attention.
I'd be happy to start with that. My osteopathic research really this is what I dealt in, as well as is listening in an osteopathic concept. And so what I looked at the neurobiology and what we are understanding right now. I want to point out to Joe Dumont, who also contributed to the book. He had pointed out when we were in our exchange together, after the conference, he had read my essay and he pointed out that, the neurobiology is interesting, it's exciting. He said it's going to be kind of irrelevant in a few years because we're learning so much. And to not mistake like the advances that we've made in our understanding and ability to articulate with it being more advanced or a more complete understanding. I think what we're trying to do in neurobiology is give some context, some language, so that we can have an exchange about it across disciplines. So that's where I'm coming from. And what I looked at was a lot of Dan Siegel's work. And the way he explains it, I found it really useful, that awareness is so, it's so complex, but he talks about it in a simple way, that we're aware that we're aware. So there's the knowing and then the knowns, what we can become aware of. And that attention is a way, in this model, attention is a way of delivering information into awareness. And that information comes from various sources. And broken down in a really simple way, attention can be from internal body sensation or interoception. It can be from external environment or exteroception, so the things we're receiving through our five senses. It can be from mental level activity, imagination, dreaming, narrative, all of those things. And it can also be from interrelational information. So the information I'm receiving because I'm in a relationship with you in a dialogue. So it's information I wouldn't be getting on my own. There's an exchange. So although none of those are separate, we separate them out in order to kind of differentiate between them. And that in that way, like attention and awareness are related to each other, so that I can turn my attention to, say, internal body sensation and receive information about my internal experience in my awareness. And I think in that way, there's a cultivation that happens because we are differentiating. I think, Gabby, you talk about this a lot too. It's like we're kind of separating out like a big mass of experience, this undifferentiated, we're separating out so that it can organize in more complex ways, and that we can develop our awareness of what's happening and how we choose to respond. So there's so much I could say about it, but I'm really interested to hear what other people have to say and how they're thinking about it.
Maybe I'll just share that in my restorative contact practice, I often offer the metaphor, it's a key word, of a garden, the garden of sensations. And as people are in the practice to perceive themselves as wandering this garden, and to let their attention land on, as if they were walking in a garden, they notice a flower, to take in its color, its texture, its scent, and to see all of the sensations that are present in the moment as something to land on, to be with. And I think it also instills a feeling of awe is not quite the right word. Brando and I were talking about this earlier today, because that also indicates some element of fear that I don't think is present, but it takes like the pressure off of like reflecting on the self in a way that feels so heavy, and it sends it outward to like this sense of maybe wonder is a little bit better, that feels uplifting and also nourishing, that you have, you know, all these companions and to be with, you know, the texture of, I can feel this blanket across my legs, and I can feel my left foot pressing into the ground. And I also recently had Danny Lepkoff come and be a guest artist in my contact improv class. And he talked about just opening ourselves up to the world as a sensual experience. And that's been just really staying with me. And it just makes things so much more enjoyable. So giving one's attention to the sensory world, yeah, I think feels very important to me. And I think one thing I want to like just acknowledge is that since it has been like a little bit of time since working on the essay, I feel like there's so many new things that are coming up for me. And just to return to this metaphor thing that a couple of folks have already mentioned, this has also been really arising in me as well. And there's a great book, Metaphors We Live By, that really shows, like everyone is saying, that these aren't just kind of decorative expressions, but they're actually ways that we understand the world. And there's so many metaphors in CI.
I'm smiling because just to tell you that that in an earlier collection called Taken by Surprise, there is a psychologist who leaned heavily on that metaphors we live by. But then Karen Schaffman, who's a contact person, talked about how you can't read a contact duet in terms of that, because the up and down and things like that all get kind of rearranged. So it was an interesting dialogue between these two essays. And yes, I appreciate the fact that one writes something, but I mean, I think the act of writing an essay and then putting, you know, ideas down, and then of course they live and they change and they move, but that, you know, for me, it's like taking your attention to those ideas gives you a broader awareness that brings out other ideas and stuff, you know, so it's a very much a kind of dialectic and a synthesis that keeps going on, not till some, you know, kind of end where you've achieved enlightenment, but you're just getting all of these different perceptions that become embedded. And I'm thinking about perceptions of ideas as well as sensations. But yeah. Somebody else want to think about the attention and awareness?
Well, for me, Gabby's image of the garden versus the flower kind of is a nice metaphor for the attention, the paying attention. I see the gestures are narrower. You're really focusing in on a certain thing. And with awareness, I think of it as a broader field. And as Leslie was talking about the stand and bringing down the sensations of what you're clearing the field of what you're focusing on, because paying attention, my daughter wants attention, my cooking wants attention. And so I do kind of segment attention and selected from the field of awareness, that I can't pay attention to something that I'm not capable of paying attention to. And so many of some of our practices, say the stand or Zen meditation or sitting in Quaker worship, is about quieting the focused attention and allowing ourselves to rest in this wider field and see if something is there that we're overlooking that wants us to bring it into some sort of manifestation.
I think the only thing I would add is just a sense of when you bring those kind of words in, and I think all the essays that we've been discussing and the way that they get so detailed about the sort of somatic process of attention, the somatic process of awareness, really heighten this, that these attention especially has a sort of quality of an event. It's something that happens in time, and something that changes the fabric uh, of interactions and somatics. And I love Anne's metaphor. I think it is a metaphor in this case of the threading awareness through attention, where uh, I think by having this kind of perspective on the process of attention, we can see it as something that isn't just sort of going on and we take for granted and the world is out there and we attend to it, but is something that really happens. There's an event of attention which restructures the nature of reality. A lot of people, several essays in this section reference the work of philosopher Karen Barad, who talks about this in a very eloquent way. Just the the sort of creative quality of attention and awareness.
Yeah, go
May I
ahead.
add one more thing? And I'm also thinking about like through attention, the awareness that I'm really interested in is the awareness of agency, the awareness that the more you notice, the more choices you have.
Cool. So we have a chat question from Nicholas Travis, whom many of us know because he spent 7 months in Oberlin in 2022. And I think that Annika can bring him into our visual field. We can attend to Nicholas's question from a visual field. So let's see if that can happen. Hi, Nicholas.
Hi, Nicholas.
Hello, let me know if my audio is okay.
Yeah, it's fine. Hi. Ooh, there's Hannah and Nicholas. Hello.
Now I have to pull up my question again and remember it.
It says, how can responsive interaction with emergence/construction via responsiveness sustain when actions are also initiated and instigated?
You guys are here about responsive touch, but like there's stimulus and we also create stimulus. So I'm curious about that instigation aspect and how there's a lot of preference in CI spaces for, oh, I love the flow. I love going with the flow. And like, how do we sustain, or just anything you guys want to say about that balance scale for a third dimension, if you want to add third, fourth, fifth dimension?
The way I'm kind of understanding your question, I think about it in terms of making decisive actions. It's more about how quickly I let go of them. So as soon as I get it's my responsiveness to change. It's not about negating my possibility of making a decisive choice to begin with.
I mean, I think this, for me, this whole question of attention and awareness has to do with training one's body to kind of attend. When you train for contact and responsive touch, at first you're attending to very specific exchanges. But then those exchanges start to build an awareness that no longer has to go through your conscious mind. And that's how we can continue to like move through so many more chaotic fields of what's going on. Like it's all of these, the stand, all of, the Zen, all of this stuff, the touch that Gabby's working on there, it's about slowing down so that we can reflect on it, become more conscious and intentional about it. But when you're dancing contact, oftentimes that builds a reflexivity that is both reflex oriented, but also thoughtful. But the thoughtful doesn't have to slow your body down. It's like a thoughtfulness that operates underneath a conscious attention. And that's why, one can move very quickly without thinking about the response. Now, of course, times, things slow down and you have lots of different choices, as Gabby says. But I think that for me, the training of, building an awareness is that awareness operates in a way that allows me to continue without having to kind of think through each experience or each event. But part of that awareness, for me at least, is also cultivated by written reflection, spoken reflection. Like you dance and then you kind of, then what Nancy used to call like harvest. You harvest what went on, and then you dance some more, and then you harvest. And the reason I wanted to do this book was I wanted to kind of see what it was like to really develop ideas past an initial harvesting reflection into really kind of more worked over analysis in order to make the dancing better, like in order to have more opportunity to kind of really come back to the dancing. For me, it's always about going out through language and ideas to come back to the dancing. So the responsiveness is cultivated on many different levels, but ultimately for me to like make the dancing more alive and important. I'm a total evangelist. I'm like, this is going to save the world. But yeah.
And Nicholas, if I understood your question right, there seemed to be a dichotomy between the listening responsive versus the instigation stimulus. And what I get really interested in is when I'm instigated and just, that's when my listening has to be strongest. And it's certainly true in Aikido that it's when the big stuff is happening is when the person who's instigating the big stuff has to be really aware and listening at each moment. So I find that they train each other to join and happen at the same time.
Yeah, I kind of think of it like a feedback loop. right? Like that it's like we're receiving information, we're listening, but listening also implies a response, because listening in one direction is just like we're not empty receptacles. We're having a response, and we're either choosing to have an outward response and take an action or not, and both things are responses. But I agree, and that I think of the stand as like a training. It's a training to differentiate these things, to really become aware of what is coming from inside of me, what's coming from outside of me. And Nicholas, you're saying like stimulus response, and that's how I'm understanding what you're talking about. I don't know if it's, but that what's coming from inside of me, what's coming from outside of me. When I can differentiate those things, I know where I am. And I think the one word I would bring in as well is intention, like with that attention, awareness. I would bring in intention, because when I set up my intention to listen, my mind is set up to function in a particular way. I don't have to keep thinking about it. So I'm having a dialogue, or I'm having a dance with somebody, and in my mind, I've done the stand. For me, it's a value that I have. I want to be in a listening dialogue, and so I don't have to think about it the whole time. That there's this setup that I've made through practice, through cultivation of awareness. And I think of that stimulus response as a feedback that's ongoing, but I've set it up in particular conditions because of my training.
Building off of that, like I think this is one of the ways in which CI subverts more traditional understanding. This idea that receiving is like, is a passive action, and what Leslie's talking about, this like feedback thing, like why I think what we learned from CI is that to receive doesn't mean that you don't have agency.
Yeah.
So I think it's just like another example of how we're sort of giving people an opportunity to repattern what it means to receive, and that these are not opposites. Same thing, the resistance and support, it's actually, they work together. And so it's like receiving, as opposed to receiving.
Thank you all.
Nicholas, I was wondering if you had anything more that you wanted to say about it, because you've clearly thought about this pretty deeply. What are your responses?
I have a bias to being a witness and watching.
Mm.
And so there's often this, Barbara Dilley talks about taking the courageous step to move into the contemplative dance open space, and that first step. And that's often a struggle. And so there's like, you're being impacted, you're being stimulated, but in that setup, there's this watching circle containing witnessing space, and then the open space and moving into that. And that's been a threshold that's really like a place of questioning for me and observing for me. But what's also up right now is Daryl Jones has a practice of like work, move your body, be really active, and then rest. And that was coming up as you all were speaking as part of that cycle of like being active and listening, and then having a harvest cycle. But also like our harvest cycle doesn't have to be that. And how can our harvest cycle also be the like move and harvest, move and harvest, or be slow and harvest. But like what's filtering in now is the encouragement to really, cross the different domains and see how they reinforce each other, and how initiation and intention, then how you then listen right on top of that. Like what you were saying with the Aikido, being at that moment of instigation, being at your top listening also.
Or that listening and being kind of receiving is also a part of the dancing, so that rather than it being like the circle is this barrier, like, the cell, a barrier that you have to like break into and shift gears. Can we rethink of that? Like I think of it when I talk a lot about how, we could think of our skin as a barrier between you and me, or we could think of the skin as pores that are porous and we can pour our energy back and forth. So I feel like the witnessing aspect or the listening aspect or the on-side aspect can also be part of that dancing, so that you get pulled in because you're in that awareness. Like the stand has the possibility of moving. Like we do the stand separate from these other things oftentimes as a separate practice in order to pay attention. But there are times when I'm by myself in a studio where I do a stand or a sitting meditation, and I allow myself to break the rules and like start to move in and out of that meditation and opening. Yeah, I think.
Well, um, if I can just quickly add, because I know there's another question, but I think what you're talking about, Nicholas, is really interesting in terms of like these different um, scales at which we can look at these intensive relationships. And it's fun to think of it almost, I think, like um, like a fractal where the dynamic is happening at every scale. So there's a sort of long time scale of maybe we have a dance and then a harvest, or and there's this cycle between the dancing and the language that Anne has been talking about. But can that same dynamic happen at sort of every level? So maybe within the dance, and maybe within a tiny moment of the dance, and within sort of every little time scale, that you could pull out some of those intensive relationships between those different ideas or at work. And I mean, I think sometimes I don't always feel it the same at every time scale. Like there's like uh one sort of one sort of level that I really feel okay, that dynamic is happening, and then at other levels it feels harder to find. But I think on some level, I sort of believe that it can work, in different ways, of course, but on every little, however you would kind of choose to look at the dance event.
Okay, so Mihal has a question. I think this is fun because we can't like turn it on to everybody, the pictures, but I invite everybody to keep asking questions, and then we'll just like keep bringing people in and keep bringing people in. It'll be great. Nihal, you want to ask your question?
This is really fun. Hi, everyone. I was curious to hear from anyone about whether you feel like you often approach dances with your research interests in mind, like subconsciously, and how that affects who you're attracted to dance with or who you trust dancing with, or something about like if there's another essay or focus that you feel like, oh, that's not how I intuitively approach contact, but I enjoy dancing or being in relationship. Like I don't approach it therapeutically, or I don't think of contact as a religious function, but that you feel attracted to dancing with, or hope that makes sense.
Well, I would say that actually it's kind of the opposite for me. That I got interested in creating a container for more mindful touch, and more, maybe I should just say more slow movement and stillness, because I do think mindfulness is a part of CI, and it's just been kind of integrated at a deeper level, like Anna's talking about, so that receiving can be sent back a little bit quicker. So my CI dancing tends to be like very focused on like playfulness, like inviting humor, inviting irreverence into it. And so I felt like I needed to create a space in order to do something that was a little bit against my nature. And also because I love CI for what it is, for the many things that it is. And I don't actually desire turning contact improv into a therapeutic practice. I don't feel like that's the space for it. So I'd rather kind of take that seed from it and then make it something separate, like for instance this weekend, for people who want to actually spend the time doing it that in that way. And that's why we're doing things a little bit different here, have more of a container of doing everything together. We have more also circling practices where we're inviting vulnerability and sharing of stories, because that helps us get into a space that I think supports the therapeutic work. That is something different when I'm just thinking about it purely social or purely about the physical responsiveness of it.
Let me just, Michal, answer a little bit by pointing to Aramo's essay in this collection, in this section. So her essay is based on a research, like a very specific research practice on queer intimacy that was moving past contact, but not in a way that was focused on genital sex. And they did this with a partner a research partner who was also interested in it, and they set up very specific times. So they're using contact and a very specific research question to, frame a practice apart from contact improvisation. The question I think that's interesting for Gabby and for Aramo and for people who maintain a very specific research focus is what happens when it comes back into, or what happens when you come back into a kind of more open contact environment. Like Gabby just said, that she has a very different interest, and that keeping up that very different interest is important. I think some people feel like that research question, or we sometimes call it labbing, can help feed into their dancing. I mean, like Brian, when you did all this kind of philosophical thinking about it, and then last semester did a kind of performance group with contact, did that essay kind of affect or infect or relate in some way? I'd be curious how you thought about that.
Oh, I mean, I think it absolutely did. Uh, I think, uh, I mean, in a way, I felt like that project where I gathered a kind of ensemble of people to do uh, improvisation together. We improvised together over a period of time, and I think the sort of the experiment of it, what we were trying to do was to follow from to really be aware of what was happening in that kind of closed container. I mean, obviously we were dancing, but what are the sort of specifics of what is happening in this group as opposed to what's happening in the jam, or as opposed to what's happening in our dances outside, and sort of use that as the inspiration of the impulses for the way we organized our continued dancing together. So there's this kind of cycling forward, and it ended in a small performance where we sort of shared kind of where we had gotten. And so I think the kind of that idea that we would look for collectively a kind of a dancing that was at the same time, it was contact improvisation, but it was also idiosyncratic and ours, was very much inspired by these questions that I had been dealing with in this essay of how do we sort of work between the specific and the general. And I don't know, I'm still reflecting on that process and that performance in terms of how it sort of goes into this question. But yes, that absolutely are working these questions through my dancing.
I mean, I'll say that there are times when your group was in a big jam and yet doing their thing in a big jam. Like I knew they were working with some kind of score, and it was really interesting to be dancing in a much kind of broader jam space with this, 5 or 6 people who were like kind of doing something else because they had that history of working together, but they were still within the jam, and you weren't sure like you're dancing next to them, but you're like, oh wait, you guys are doing, it was a very interesting kind of meshing that didn't quite that had nice edges to it, I would say. We have another question, and Emily, hi.
Hello. Such a great conversation. Happy to be here. Um, I am going to read my question. But this builds off of Mihal's question and curious to talk about, yeah, setting up containers for your research or inquiry or labbing. Or if for some of you it feels more like something you're just contemplating in your general CI experience. But I am especially interested in people who are like crossing these like therapeutic, maybe medical practices and spiritual work, and how you might talk about this to non-dance people. Like I think, I'm I'm making the assumption that most of the people here today are coming as like CI dancers, as like a common identity or practice that we all have. But I am really interested in like how you talk about this with your colleagues that you might be collaborating with in other fields. And you might think of it as like, what kind of hats do you consider yourself wearing as far as like an artist or facilitator, researcher, guide? Yeah.
I can respond to that. Thanks for your question, Emily, and Michal too, because I think they're both so related. I sort of, I have to think about this, I think, a little bit more, but the first thing that comes to mind is that I sort of separate this out a little bit, similar to what Gabby was saying. It's that I have a research practice, and I'm primarily a researcher more than, I wouldn't call myself like a contact teacher, contact improvisation teacher. But what I do is that I take contact improvisation as a tool in my research process, right? As a research tool, as a teaching tool, in that process. And I will work, like when I'm working one-on-one, for example, with people, what I'm doing is trying to create language that is relatable to people who would never have entered a jam space or would never have experienced this otherwise. But the principles that we explore in contact improvisation are so useful because it's a human body in relation with gravity. I mean, and so what I am often doing is trying to figure out, like, how do we move from the table? I don't think of it necessarily as a therapeutic process, osteopathy. I think of it as like a education process, a person learning about their own system and how I can facilitate that. And so I'm always looking for ways of how do we move from the table into gravity, like into a standing position, and to be able to integrate what we learned on the table and things like the stand, things like this nonverbal dialogue where there's an exchange, not a one directional, I'm touching you, but that there's this teaching people to respond, where maybe in a context like that, they would feel they didn't have I don't know what the word is, but that it's usually a one way. When you're working with an osteopath or a body worker or a therapist, it's usually like a one way, and that a person can actually learn to respond, I think teaches them so much. So when I go into, say, a contact improvisation context, that to me is a bit separate. And what I try to do is relate to the person that I'm with. So I don't know what their interests are. And of course, my research interest is always active. My mind is bananas. It's always with this stuff. But I do try and set it aside. There's a beautiful quote in osteopathy. I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces of writing in osteopathy by an elder named Anne Wales. And she talked about when we make appropriate contact as a listening presence, we come into relation with things as they are. And I think that that's my underlying hope when I enter into dancing with people, is to really let go of the preconditioned bias and predictive, behaviors. That's the way our brain operates, like we're a predictive system. But this idea of listening gives us an opportunity to cultivate that gap where we can receive present moment information and not be reliant on the predictive coding that we carry around with us. And that to me is the most fascinating thing about walking into a jam or dancing with people that I don't know. Or even people that I've had long, like 25-year dancing relationships with, is like, who are you right now? I want to receive present moment information rather than rely on the things that I've experienced with you before.
And I'd love to piggyback on that right now, because I think that that's essential. That's an essential practice in Zen Buddhism, certainly, and also in Quakerism. It's being present to what's there without projecting anything from the past, without grasping for anything in the future. So there's this practice. I referenced Nancy talking about the underscore and everybody being in all the time, and everybody who's in the room is part of the whole. So some of my practice is figuring out how I can be open to everything that's there, not pick and choose, but to be open to that. Suzuki Roshi used to talk about things as it is. And he continued to do that even when his English improved, that to have the plural and the singular, that there is a wholeness that is also very separate. So to hold that tension of relating to things as it is, which includes the whole.
I think, Emily, one of the things that, so when I wrote How to Land, Finding Ground in an Unstable World, which is a book I put out in 2019, that book did attempt to really bring in a lot of what I thought were very potent practices about gravity, about connection from contact, not just contact, but contact specifically, and make them accessible to people who could use them, like Gabby's doing, could use them in other situations as a way to just become grounded in a very chaotic world. So I think there are these interesting places of translation where contact gets translated, or a lot of the practices get translated into other places for other populations.
I'll also add that, like, I identify as an artist. I've identified myself as an artist to this group that we're working with now, and that my artistic practice, my creative practice is a wellness practice for me. It's a practice of asking questions and noticing, like, why does this particular situation make me feel a little bit uncomfortable? How can I create something that allows me to explore it? And so, I had some insecurities related to like the article and this workshop, in terms of, like, how can I speak to what is, therapeutic? I'm not a therapist. But then I really felt, there's something different between therapeutic and therapy. And everything that I'm sharing is coming from my personal experience. It's a somatic experience of me doing the research with my own body. And so I think that honesty and transparency of, like, look, I'm sharing just what's true with me, tends to land pretty well in other people, that they then are like, oh, your experience reflects in me in this way. And we actually find, like, much more connection by simply just speaking to our personal experience.
Cool. Michelle, I think you have a question also.
Yes, thank you. This has been very interesting. So I thought when Carol described many of the essays in this section are pushing the boundaries of CI and sexually, psychologically, and spiritually, with that quote from Steve saying that's not part of the equation. But we can't pretend that those things aren't in the room. And I thought you did a good job of talking about that. And when we say we're blind to those things, just as when we say like we're race blind and then something racist happens, then there's no language for or acknowledgement that this is a thing, even much less language to try and talk about it. So I do like acknowledging that this stuff is in the room, but then I have to say I did feel a little uncomfortable with some of the edges of what was being explored. So how do you, and as you know, my whole thing is creating safer, brave space. So my question is, if we're consciously expanding the boundaries of CI to include these other elements that are in the room, and I guess acknowledging that they're in the room, how do we then also create safety around exploring that? Because we may not be in a position, we may not be therapists or spiritual healers or people that can handle these other issues, or medical professional, whatever.
I think I also, just believe that working our edge is where we're learning and growing. So you can also perceive it not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And so I think another thing that I feel like I personally benefit from in terms of my teaching by not being a therapist is that I'm not assuming that there's anything wrong with anyone. They're not coming to me to be fixed. Like, they're just coming for greater self-knowledge and for learning, as Leslie also mentioned. And so it's a bit more, I think starting from that place is really helpful, of just putting people in a space of like collaboration, of curiosity, of optimism, of wonder is just I don't know. That's been a strategy for me of how to work with also taking risks at the same time. And we talk about that here in terms of like, we are encouraging folks to take a step in the direction of risk, but also to honor their self, to honor others, and to know that sometimes, feelings around touch and social environments, things can come up later, and we're available to hear about that and address concerns as they arise. This kind of this partnership. And I like to make environments that feel really friendly and warm and welcoming. That I think that sense of belonging it just creates the right kind of atmosphere in order to touch on the edges.
I agree that embracing the discomfort is really useful. And then to have clear practices of exploring it together, so you're not isolated. If something comes up, that there is a way and a habit and a culture of not just, oh, this is uncomfortable, I can't mention it, but to use that listening skills that we have through our somatic senses with each other as we more concretely make explicit what our personal experience is. So it's always been a messy form, and it's kind of great. And I sometimes get confused what safety is. I mean, as far as in a psychological sense, what is safe? And if you put the boundary too close, that I'm uncomfortable because I have a habitual way of being, that would be really useful for me to explore. The XCI essay was fascinating for me and really rich, and not of my experience, but it was, I'm going to be rereading that several more times just to see where it's touching me in places that I don't have a lived experience. So There's my 2 cents.
Your question, Leslie, you might want to, it made me think, Michelle, your question made me think of that section in Leslie's essay where she talks about having a concussion and learning how to fall again. And that kind of relationship of the stand to feeling comfortable to fall after having had a harm to, as a result of falling, I'm assuming. But you want to talk about that, Leslie, at all?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things, and I see that we're at the end, so I'll try and keep it brief because there's so much to say. And I'll start by saying I'm not an organizer, so I'm not speaking from a place of experience when it comes to organizing jams and the complexity of that and all of the holding the space in that way. I am leery, and I think there's a great deal of caution about imposing external rules. And what I tried to focus on in the essay through that experience and was really investigating, like, how do I differentiate when I'm uncomfortable, when I'm unsafe? What can I learn from disorientation? I think Nancy Stark Smith said it in terms of remaining awake within disorientation, that these are all skill sets, and that as a teacher, what I across my disciplines, it's not just in contact, but as a teacher, what I like to really bring, I think the value that I can bring is in terms of helping a person orient to their own shape, their own experience, and then how to listen internally and externally as well at the same time. So having a concussion, it was a real process of learning, am I uncomfortable here, or is this really unsafe? And it was a way of retraining reflexes, because these are reflexes that in contact improvisation, we actually train to sort of override certain reflexes, right? And so that takes a lot of practice, a lot of training, and a lot of awareness. And I think that's a vital piece in any situation where we're bringing many different kinds of people together with many different kinds of lived experiences and many different value systems, and that's exciting to me. And it's dangerous in some ways, and there's lots to negotiate. But I think the contribution that I feel that I could make is how do I do that as an individual in the context of that environment.
Cool. Great. So yeah, you're right. We are kind of coming to an end. I don't know if anyone had another, like, a final comment or anything. Thank you so much for joining. Wait, hold on. There's Annika. Yes. Okay. Question. One more question. Who's asking the question? Is that you, Annika?
No, that's Nicholas again.
Oh, okay. Okay. Nicholas, you want to come back on and ask the question? Okay, I'll read
He's
it.
coming. He's coming.
Oh, okay. Hi.
Hi, it's me this time.
Oh, hi, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Wait, I want to see where oh, shoot. Okay, I feel like I'm also better at writing things than talking about them. So
Okay.
hopefully I'll remember it as articulately. But I'm curious about, like, something that also came up for me, I think specifically reading Brian's chapter, but in some case it feels like it's in the air, is like the emergence of conscious or like verbal thought from nonverbal or subconscious thought, that like movement can help us build an awareness, but then it gets into writing, or it gets into this like expanded awareness that's not just nonverbal or in the body. And I'm thinking about, like, in terms of safety, if you have suggestions, like, a lot of that seems to do with expanding awareness from like the individual person dancer that might be like happening in a therapeutic or individual experience into like a group or a jam experience. And so yeah, I'm curious, like, if you have suggestions for expanding awareness from like what might be happening in an individual person to what might be happening in a space. Does that make sense?
That's a quick question.
I know. I didn't say it was a quick question. I said, I'm sorry, I know we're almost out of time, but that's what I was thinking about listening to you all.
I think that's a great final question because it's unanswerable, right? It's what we all are doing our research on. That's as writers, we're trying to encapsulate that and failing again and again.
I mean, I would say that that whole discussion of internal, external, that sense of touch as not just one way, but reciprocal, it's also a way of, like, when you say from the individual to the group, but you're always in a space together. So I think the when we sometimes attend to ourselves, like generally speaking, in jam situations, in class situations, very often you have the space to attend to yourself, right? But in jam situations, I encourage people who enter a jam to recognize like they're entering a space that is a group space. And if they want to have specific time or focus for themselves, it's best to kind of, isolate yourself or go to a corner, not to do that in the middle of a lot of other people dancing. So for me, it's a kind of spatial awareness that I can bring attention to my own need to like warm up my right knee because, it has some needs today. But at the same time, I'm always still aware of sounds in the space, people in the space, the energy of the space. So, and I think maybe that's because, I am a facilitator and a teacher, and it's really hard for me to walk into a jam in almost any space without having some headspace of like awareness of who's poobah over in the corner, who's like, I just kind of am hardwired to that after so many decades of being in that role. But yeah, I think it's not an either or. I feel like it's shifting that, attention, but keeping, yeah, maybe that's it. You shift your attention, but you keep your awareness. Like it's both. Yeah.
One thing I would say that as a teacher, I think what I'm trying to do constantly in the context of your comment and question, Hannah, is that how I'm always asking the question, how do I help students or people learn to make their own connections so that they're learning to teach themselves what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, how to navigate the unknown, basically, and become friendly with it. And so what are the tools? It's a skill set and a tool, a set of tools.
Great. I'm going to ask everybody who's on the picture to thank Annika. Yay!
Yay!
Who's my student assistant who's setting up all of this so that it runs pretty smoothly. So thank you very much, Annika. Thank you, all the people who are out there in the non-scene land and the panelists again. And just to say that next week, exactly same time, noon Eastern Standard Time, we'll be working with people who are contributors to the last section, which is local communities, global contexts. So have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Kelly Hurlburt.